You're listening to a Revolution Truth podcast, NDAA Lawsuit Q&A, a live panel discussion with Carl Mayer, Bruce Afran, Daniel Ellsberg, Birgitta Jónsdóttir, David Segal, Kevin Gosztola, Michael Kelley, Laura Poitras, and Jacob Applebaum, hosted by Tangerine Bolen.
Welcome to the Hedges v. Obama roundtable discussion and Q&A. The goal of this broadcast today is to discuss the implications of our NDAA lawsuit, our hopes for a permanent injunction on Section 1021, and how you can ensure that we win this and reverse this travesty of justice. This lawsuit was originally filed by Pulitzer Prize-winning author Chris Hedges and two of his attorneys, Carl Mayer and Bruce Afran. I approached this dynamic team with the hopes of pursuing a class action lawsuit last January for multiple reasons. Part of my reasoning was that I personally feared what could happen to me under the NDAA given my work with RevolutionTruth and to our entire team, and our activities centered on WikiLeaks and an upcoming Middle Eastern panel series. We also witnessed an outpouring of profound dismay and alarm from people around the world in activist communities of all political stripes and persuasions over this law. Our liberties have been steadily and dramatically undermined since 9/11, and the bizarre decision to lie to the American people and to the world and force us into a war in a country that had absolutely nothing to do with that fateful day. The lies, spin, propaganda, intimidation, suppression of evidence, and threats of harm that led us into that war set the stage for a decade of policymaking that has undermined the rule of law, broken down mechanisms of accountability and transparency in the United States government, threatened our Constitution, flouted international law, murdered between several 100,000 and over 1 million Iraqi people, and caused untold and unnecessary harm to our own soldiers and their families. It's been a decade of the United States government digging its heels in rather than behaving with integrity and protecting the U.S. Constitution and basic human rights. One end result of policies that are based on deceit and manipulation is this law that effectively suspends due process in this nation and threatens First Amendment rights for citizens of the U.S., while suspending basic rights for citizens in the world. I'm sorry to say that I'm disgusted by my government. That said, this entire panel of people, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, give me hope every day, and so does our audience. I would say the majority of our audience is quite committed to defending civil liberties and human rights, so onward and upward, let's win this case. With no further ado, I'll introduce our panel. It's the largest one we've had, so bear with us. And some quick housekeeping first. I'll be taking some of your questions during the call and also at the end. It's going to be a quick discussion. We've got with us our two lead attorneys, Carl Mayer and Bruce Afran. Both of these attorneys attempted to prosecute the three big telecom companies over the Bush illegal wiretapping scandal. We've also got plaintiff Daniel Ellsberg, who released the Pentagon Papers and is known as one of the foremost whistleblowers in United States history. We have the honorary Birgitta Jónsdóttir, Icelandic parliamentarian who has spearheaded the world's strongest freedom of information laws. We have Laura Poitras, award-winning filmmaker and documentarian whose My Country, My Country is a film about life for Iraqis under U.S. occupation and was nominated for an Academy Award. We also have Jacob Applebaum, independent computer security researcher and hacker employed by the University of Washington. Both Jacob and Laura are with us because they considered being plaintiffs in this case. We'll explain what happened with that. And both of whom have been pretty heavily harassed by the U.S. government, which we'll let them explain. We have David Segal, executive director of Demand Progress, a partner on this lawsuit. Kevin Gosztola, a prominent blogger and journalist who writes for Op-Ed News and Fire Dog Lake. And last, we have Michael Kelley, who is a writer for Business Insider. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today, and glad to have you with us.
Happy to be here.
So first and foremost, I think we need to do a quick recap of this case and where we stand. Essentially, we filed suit in January. Carl and Bruce, can you kind of give us a quick update on what's going on now?
Sure. Tangerine. Carl, you want to go first? No, why don't you, Bruce? Because I think you have to leave a little early, right? So
yeah,
go ahead.
Call a little sooner. Tangerine, first, thank you, Tangerine, for everything you've done in organizing this great plaintiffs group. You know, a case can't go forward unless the plaintiffs have standing and have interests that the court says are concrete enough to bring a case. And thanks to you and, of course, Chris Hedges, we have that group of plaintiffs. The Judge Catherine Forrest, entered a preliminary injunction against the law in her decision in May, and that put the law on a complete ban in the United States. The law that says those who are substantially supporting Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated groups, whatever that means, can be placed in military detention indefinitely is now suspended. That law has now been declared unconstitutional. We are now going to have a final hearing on Tuesday where we expect the judge will change her preliminary order into a final order. And we assume the government will then appeal that. Obviously, the judge could change her position. We don't think she will based on the government's arguments and what she has said. And we expect that the final injunction will go forward. One further point, the government asked her to limit the order to only these individual plaintiffs and only to within the Southern District of New York, which is really Manhattan. And not in response to that, Judge Forrest said, not only won't she limit it to these plaintiffs, but she is making certain that the order is understood to apply to the entire country. Nowhere in the United States can this statute be enforced based on her order. So it's a very sweeping decision.
I'm actually going to jump in there with a clarifying question, Bruce, and that is, what about the rest of the planet? Is it a preliminary injunction on Section 1021 for citizens of other nations?
Oh, I'm very glad you asked that. It is an injunction against the United States government from enforcing this statute anywhere.
Yes. Great.
So actually, to go, this is Carl Mayer. So to underline what you said earlier, Tangerine, when you were contemplating, and I know you've been working with David Segal and his organization, you've been contemplating a class action. The effect of the judge's expanded preliminary injunction is really almost the same as the class action, in that it protects anyone, any journalist, any activist from being targeted under this unconstitutional statute. So for the moment, until the judge decides otherwise, that's the state of play.
Yes, and I actually want to make a quick point on that part of the impetus, and a major impetus for this lawsuit was, and to go for a class action suit, was because so many people are so worried, and understandably so, after this panoply of laws and policies and a decade of a surreal war on terror. So thank you for clarifying that, Carl. A lot of people have asked us if they could become plaintiffs and why can't they. In a few moments, we're going to go a little bit deeper into standing, and I'll have you guys talk about that, but let's keep it general for now. But it's so nice to see that although we couldn't proceed as I had originally hoped and we had hoped, the outcome has been, better than expected, and it's been exactly what we were aiming for so far. So next, there's been a lot of confusion and unfortunately some misinformation about the NDA Section 1021 and what it does and does not do. And even prominent attorneys on both sides of the political spectrum have debated that publicly. One of the primary issues of contention, and certainly one between our lawyers and the government attorneys, has been the AUMF and whether this simply extends the powers of the 2001 AUMF or not. So again, sticking with the attorneys, can you first tell us quickly what the AUMF is, and also why you're contending that absolutely it does not, and why the judge agreed with that?
Well, Tangerine, this is Bruce Afran. The AUMF was simply the declaration of war, essentially, in which Congress passed in 2001 to allow the president to take military action against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban after the 9/11 attacks. And it simply authorized the president not only to attack those entities, but to take into custody those who participated in those terrorist attacks and those who harbored them.
Okay.
So that's the AUMF. That's the first part of your question.
Yes. So
Carl, jump in if you like. The next issue, though, is whether or not the AUMF is the only law that covered detention, or whether or not the NDAA simply repeats or echoes what was already in the AUMF. And very simply, Judge Forrest found, and she accepted our arguments entirely on this point, that the AUMF was limited to those who participated in the terrorist attacks. It says nothing about detaining those who give substantial support, whatever that means, to such organizations. This is a new provision in the NDAA, and the judge agreed with us entirely that this was never in the law before. The government tried to argue that because this was always in the law in the government's view, there's nothing new here, and our plaintiffs have nothing new to fear, and therefore the case should be dismissed. The judge rejected that argument because the NDAA very clearly expands the AUMF, and it creates a whole new basis for detaining people based purely on speech. And the judge agreed. In fact, she rejected the government's argument that this is not a speech statute. She said this threatens speech and political speech, and that's why she put it under an injunction. Carl, did you want to jump in too?
Well, I think I would just add that the AUMF was very narrowly targeted at Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and those who specifically participated in the 9/11 attacks. What the NDAA does is it creates a whole new category of people, which is basically anyone who gives substantial support to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or even quote associated forces. So this is all part of the government's efforts to expand the executive branch power to chill free speech, whether by reporters or activists, to expand executive branch power to use the national security state to go after not just terrorists involved in the 9/11 attack, but anyone that the government considers to be a terrorist organization. And as we've seen from a number of our plaintiffs who are activists or dissidents, the government tries to put activists and dissidents under the terrorist label, and this is all part and parcel of it. And I'm hoping that Judge Forrest's courageous preliminary injunction will be the start of a real effort to overturn this whole panoply of laws that are slowly but surely diminishing the free speech rights in this country.
And quickly, actually, because this is an audience question, what is standing, and what determines, some people having standing and others not making standing?
Oh, well, Tangerine, standing is very simple. You can't just bring a case because you don't like a law. You have to be affected by it. You have to have some interest that's strong enough to justify the court giving an opinion about the law or declaring the law to be unconstitutional. If we don't like a law, but it doesn't affect us, we don't have the right to go to court. Standing is literally your right to stand in court and contest the law. If you don't have enough of an interest, you don't have that right. So the government says two things. One, that because we've always done this under the AUMF, and we've never done it to people like you who are activists, you have nothing to fear, and therefore no reason to be in court, no standing. Then they say that the activities of the plaintiffs just aren't close enough to what Congress meant to even remotely be threatened. But we don't know what Congress meant, because all the law says is substantial support is enough to lead you into detention. And so standing is the ability to say, this law affects me close enough that I have a right to be here. Alexa O'Brien with U.S. Day of Rage was labeled by the Department of Homeland Security as an entity associated with Muslim extremist groups. Well, that's pretty darn close to being said to be associated with them or to be substantially supporting them. So we think that our people have standing. The judge agreed, and the government's offered no reason to say otherwise.
Okay. So I'd like to bring this to Birgitta and Daniel for a moment, and then ask some questions of Laura and Jacob. Birgitta, your Twitter account was subpoenaed by the United States government for your having worked briefly with the organization WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And can you say a little bit more about what you've been told by your parliament about traveling to the U.S.? I know we were hoping to get you here to be able to testify in person. It didn't go that way. Can you just kind of explain what happened?
Yeah, well, I'm very happy to be on this panel. I helped WikiLeaks co-produce a video called Collateral Murder, and I put my name to it as a co-producer. And I also worked quite extensively with Assange and Daniel Ellsberg on figuring out where to find the best possible laws in the world to protect freedom of information, expression, and speech. Since they had hands-on experience by managing to have the material up no matter what. In January 2010, I got an email from Twitter, and actually Jacob Applebaum happened to be in Iceland on a holiday, and so I notified him that I noticed that his name was also on this list of people that had their Twitter accounts subpoenaed. And the letter from the U.S. government that Twitter managed to unseal basically said that the Department of Justice demanded to have personal information handed over without our knowledge within 3 days. And we probably would never have known unless Twitter managed to win this court case. And I don't know how it's in Jacob Applebaum's case or with Rob Conkleb, but apparently there are 3 more social media companies or some companies that have been forced to hand over our information. And so basically what it caused an uproar in Iceland because both the Speaker of the Icelandic Parliament and the Foreign Affairs Ministry and the Interior Ministry got extremely upset and took it further. So this case has caused a full report being drafted by the International Parliamentary Union and the Human Rights Committee at the IPU put forward a resolution that was unanimously adopted that expressed very grave concerns about the fact that we have all become Americans now, not in a good way, because it doesn't really matter where you store your information, even if it just passes through the United States in a cloud. They have the right to go into your private data, and if they reach as far as going into a member of parliament from a sovereign country, then how far are they willing to reach into the ordinary people's accounts for activists, for journalists, and so forth? And the problem is that we never know about it. As a result of all of this, I have not been able to travel to the United States because the State Department in Iceland has advised me not to. I have gotten messages from the Department of Justice that I can travel, but still, since they can't give me any guarantees in writing, only verbal, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the State Department have basically said, don't go. And there is really no way for me to go unless I go as a part of a UN delegation. Okay.
And so I think that your story with this gets to the heart of the gray area that I think both journalists and activists have been contending with for the last year and a half, or obviously much longer, but especially of late, that there is a ton of gray area. We don't exactly know what's going on behind the scenes, and just what happened in court, which we'll get back to in just a moment, and also the subsequent briefs that came from the United States government attorneys have, and this is just my opinion, and Carl and Bruce and anyone else, please let me know if you think that this is incorrect, but to me it's illustrated this level of arrogance and condescension toward the plaintiffs in this case and the general public around our work to guard civil liberties as frivolous and not having merit, as people being radical or fringe because we're so concerned about these issues, and so on and so forth. And there's just been this sort of expectation that maybe no judge would stand up and issue the ruling that Judge Forrest did. and take this in the direction that seems to be entirely unanticipated on their behalf. I mean, Carl and Bruce, would you concur with that sentiment?
Well, I would say, and I'm reading right here from the government's trial brief, and maybe we didn't make clear earlier, Tangerine, that there is a trial on a permanent injunction that would enjoin this law permanently, and that trial is next Tuesday, August 7th at 2 o'clock in the federal courthouse in the Southern District of New York, which is open to the public if they want to see the battle for civil rights in America in action. That's where it'll be. But I'm reading right here from the government's trial brief, where they say point blank that the plaintiffs in their case are trying to make their showing that this law applies to them based on, quote, fanciful, paranoid, or otherwise unreasonable allegations that they face detention. So that's the government's words in their trial brief. And so when they start characterizing serious journalists and activists in that way, you see that even the Obama administration has joined with their predecessors in elevating the needs of the security state over the civil liberties of activists. And I think that's a very disturbing development, and I'm hoping this judge continues to stand up to it.
And
it's also interesting that they're basically saying that the Icelandic State Department is paranoid, which is very interesting. But may I add something quite important to this, and that is how badly this law is written and how easy it is to actually put on the terrorist cloak on anything. And let's not forget that the Vice President of the United States actually labeled WikiLeaks as cyber terrorists. So I guess, I must be a terrorist, and any of you who support us are, guilty by association.
Yeah, Tangerine, let me say one thing if I can. This is Bruce Afran. I didn't think her ruling was at all unexpected, if that was your question. Her ruling follows normal First Amendment jurisprudence, in which Congress cannot pass overbroad laws that limit or target speech. And her decision actually is not revolutionary. It is directly within the scope of normal traditional First Amendment case law. In fact, in our reply brief, and it may surprise many people listening in, one of the strongest sources of protection for free speech law is Justice Scalia, who has given a very broad statement that we have relied on in this case. And so it's not even a matter of liberals versus conservatives. When it comes to free speech, very often conservatives are right on target with liberals. And Justice Scalia is actually the author of much of the case law. And this is not at all unexpected. What Judge Forrest did was exactly what I thought she should do and would do in the end.
So it wasn't unexpected on our end, but it just the attitude from the government seemed like it was somewhat unanticipated, but that's conjecture. So let me actually dive in with a quick question from an audience member and then get back to some of our other panelists. One person has asked, how can Congress make unconstitutional or anti-constitutional laws? How does this happen? Because David Segal works day in, day out to protect us from that. And, sometimes they win, sometimes they don't. Congress overwhelmingly passed this, or signed on to it, passed it. Sorry.
Well Congress does that a lot. And, and it's the job of lawyers in the courts to cut it down. That's the nature of our system. Congress can pass whatever it wants. The courts then step in.
Okay. I want to jump back quickly to the idea that, we're overreacting to the Section 1021 of the NDAA and quickly bring this to Laura and Jacob, who actually have experienced some harm, as I understand it, from just doing the work they do as professionals. So I guess we'll start with you, Laura. Can you just tell us quickly a little bit about what's happened to you and the number of times you've been detained, for example?
Sure. First, I want to thank the lawyers and the plaintiffs for bringing the case forward. It was a bit of bright news in an otherwise pretty bleak landscape. So my situation is I'm a documentary filmmaker, and I made a film about the war in Iraq. And after I finished that film, I was put on a watch list. I know that I'm on a watch list because I've been stopped 50 times at the U.S. borders, and I'm met by agents at the airplane when my plane lands. Of course, the government won't acknowledge that I'm on a watch list because they don't acknowledge that there is a watch list. But I found FOIAs that do indicate that I'm on some list, and they're often rejected. So what happens to me is that so every time I travel, I'm interrogated and detained, usually at the U.S. border, and I'm often stopped and interrogated at the departing country. So I'm stopped by Homeland Security, for instance, in London or Amsterdam, in Paris, and asked about my activities, where I've been, what I'm working on, who I've seen, where I've, phone numbers, anything that they want. And of course, I assert my rights as a journalist not to answer any of these questions. And this has been going on now since 2006 in my case. And I've been threatened at the U.S. border. I've been told that if I don't answer their questions, they'll find their answers on my electronics. I've been told that my failure to answer their questions, U.S. government questions about where I've been and who I visited, that they find very suspicious, that I'm not willing to help my country by answering their questions. And so after I made the film in Iraq, I then made a film in Yemen that was about Guantanamo, war on terror, and Al-Qaeda. And I spent a lot of time going back and forth between the U.S. and Yemen. And on the basis of that, on the basis of basically my work and the sort of vagueness of the wording of the NDAA, I'm very vulnerable to being targeted under, what they describe, just for doing the work that I do. And so is any journalist who works in a conflict zone. And so I think the population should be very concerned about this if we want to actually live in a country that has a free press.
And an Obama-appointed federal judge agrees with that. So, contrary to the government's opinion, Jacob, can you quickly say as well some of what has happened in your case?
Sure. So first of all, I was going to say that I'm actually a developer with the Tor project, and I'm an independent security researcher, just as a little bit of background. And that has caused the government to bring some of its weight to bear on my daily life. So probably the best example of this was in 2010, after I gave the keynote for Julian Assange at Hackers on Planet Earth. When I returned to the United States, I was detained by Immigration Customs Enforcement, and in fact, they had a member of the U.S. Army that was present in this interrogation. They denied me a lawyer and let me know that if I didn't go along with whatever it was that they wanted, that I would be punished, and it would be an endless punishment. And when I asked them to clarify if they were saying that they would be punishing me because of a lack of cooperation or something like this, they said, well, this is just the way that the system works. We put you on this list, and there's nothing that anybody can do after that. And so after this event, another probably dozen-plus times, I've been detained. After I went and visited Birgitta in Iceland, I was met at the gate with a computer forensics agent as well as a number of Immigration Customs Enforcement people. This sort of harassment lately has tapered off a little bit, I think, due to the fact that both Laura and I have made a really large stink about the fact that these guys are acting like total fascists. And it seems to be the case that things are turning, but it is also the case that things aren't really turning for everybody if they just turn for us because we have made a big stink.
You mean in the case of you and Laura specifically, not the case of the NDAA?
Exactly. Okay. Exactly, right? So things look like they're going well, but for systemic change, we can't just look at one or two examples, like the example of Laura or myself. But I'm very appreciative of the fact that things seem to be changing, but the lawsuit that you guys are fighting, and the reason that I was interested in joining it, is specifically because this accusation of paranoia is absolutely preposterous. I'm a nobody. And if I'm being detained and threatened with indefinite detention, I'm being denied a lawyer, I'm having my property seized, I'm getting visits from the FBI because of speaking in public about political feelings and being questioned only about the war. Not once did they ask me about anything I need to be bringing into the country, which is generally what Customs is supposed to be asking you about. Not once was I asked about something related to taxes or something related to importation or duty or smuggling or anything like that. I was asked about the Iraq War. I was asked about the Afghan War and various other things. So the systemic change, I think, is what is necessary. And the fact that they might be letting up on me personally is only so that I believe, so that I won't continue to press for justice for everybody, which is why I wish to join the lawsuit, specifically because justice for everybody is the only way I know that I can ensure justice for myself.
Well, and thank goodness Judge Forrest issued a stern clarifying order saying, of course, this doesn't apply just to the 7 plaintiffs who brought this case, but to everyone everywhere, which we were quite grateful for. I want to get to Daniel Ellsberg for just a moment. Daniel, you obviously released the Pentagon Papers. You are, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most lauded whistleblowers in U.S. history. We know today that the fate of whistleblowers is not too great, and I'd just like to quickly hear from you how you feel about what was going on then versus the milieu that we are ensconced in now, and what the NDAA means to you.
Well, let me put it in this context. I was the first person prosecuted for a leak in this country. We had the Espionage Act since 1917, but it was intended to cover espionage, or basically secret conveyance of information to an enemy, especially in wartime, or foreign power. It had never been intended to be used against disclosures to the American public, and it had never been used for that purpose. So I have, in my own experience, the occasion of the government broadly interpreting an act that had existed for half a century by that time in a new way to move against my speech, my disclosures to the American public. Now, since that time, prior to Obama, 2 other cases were brought. Samuel Loring Morrison, the only case that led to a jury conviction and a short prison sentence by Samuel Loring Morrison, about 10 years after my case, and then the APAC case, which was dropped basically by the Obama administration. Those were the only 3 cases using this so-called Espionage Act, 18 U.S.C. 793, paragraphs D and E, against leaks, against speech, truth-telling to the American public. 3 cases. President Obama, who came in promising and campaigning on unprecedented transparency in his government, and having actually lauded whistleblowers at several points, has brought 6 such cases so far, with the Assange and WikiLeaks case still pending, apparently, in a grand jury, and possibly others to come. In other words, twice as many as all previous presidents together. So I see ourselves then in a trend here, I don't know if it can be called a trend, a new data point, a shift, really, not so much a trend, toward criminalizing disclosures to the American people by this administration, and people worry about some of these powers claimed by Obama might mean in the hands of his successor. Well, I don't need to worry about his successor, whether it's Romney or Sarah Palin or McCain or whoever. What we're seeing right now from Obama is basically an assault on the Constitution and on free speech and the First Amendment, as we saw under Bush. But it's continued that very enthusiastically, virtually, by Obama. I didn't expect much from a new president in terms of eschewing powers abuses that had been bequeathed to him by his predecessor. But I have to say that President Obama is operating at the, shall I say, lower end or below the lower end of my expectations here. So we have a campaign that's been going on for years under George W. Bush, and now for almost 4 years under Obama. In the course of that, the reason I'm a plaintiff in this suit is related to the fact that not only might I have to worry about what might happen in the future to plaintiffs, people like myself, as you say, dissidents or dissenters or activists, but what I can feel right now when lawyers ask me whether I felt that the NDAA chilled my free speech, my public speech right now, my first reaction was, I'm too old to feel that chill. I'm too old to worry about what the government's going to say or even do. in terms of prosecution. I've been through that, and I can go through it again in terms of what I say publicly. But then I thought again about it. Free speech doesn't involve only what I say publicly on a program like this, on an op-ed or an article or something. After all, for that, where it's a question of I'm saying something to the public that I stand behind, and if they want to prosecute me for it, we'll go into court and we'll all argue about whether that was properly criminalized or not. I'm prepared to do that. I'm prepared to be prosecuted. I'm prepared to go to prison if necessary on these issues for these public statements. Then it occurred to me the NDAA, when it talks about speech, applies also to my speech on the phone and my speech in email and faxes and all that, and even any kind of thing, private speech that someone might be blackmailed into informing about. And that's also free speech. Now, when I'm talking to a friend, let's say far from surveillance, I'm not quite sure where that would be, in an open field here somewhere. That would be, again, I could probably feel perhaps fairly free. But in terms of what I'm saying electronically, by email or phone or anything like that, my assumption right now is that all of that is recorded by the National Security Agency. Not that it's that somebody's listening to it in real time, but it's recorded and stored and possibly Googled, in effect. And I don't think that just because I'm so important or I'm as much of a thorn in their side as I would like to be, but because I think they do it all. I think they get everybody, all of it, this and everything else. And I ask myself, am I equally willing to be detained or forever without charges, sent away somewhere, essentially incommunicado, because of the way they interpret something I've said in more or less in private or intended to be in private, with no way of presenting that to the public or defending it in public or explaining it. And I decided, no, I wouldn't make the same chances in doing that. So when it comes to communicating with people about, let's say, the Bradley Manning case or about Julian Assange, my friend and someone that I admire on the whole, very much so. When I talk about his case or what he might do, anything like that, that could lead to suspicion of my dealing with an associated group here. Now, what is an associated group? Bradley Manning is on trial right now, facing the charge, the absurd charge, military charge, of giving aid and comfort to the enemy by his telling. That's, as they say, an absurd charge, but he could go to life in prison for that. Now, if he is, that's very close, pretty darn close to an assertion of treason, and certainly he's accused of helping in his trial. I heard this myself when I was there. They accused him of giving aid and comfort to terrorist groups who would be helped supported by the revelation of American war crimes in Iraq or Afghanistan, which were revealed by WikiLeaks and allegedly or charged with Bradley Manning as having released those. Well, that's pretty close to accusing him of being associated with such groups or helping them. I certainly mean to help his defense, and I don't have to be suspected of that. It's true. I am supporting his defense, and I certainly support Julian Assange's revelations. So my speech, in short, is being chilled right now, if I think about it. And it does affect my call. It does affect who I talk to. So I feel that I have a standing right now.
And thank you so much for being with us, Daniel, both today and on our case in general. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. So I actually want to bring this back. We've got a bunch of questions from our audience, and we can tie this back into our lawyers for a second, and then I do have questions for David Segal and Kevin Gosztola and Michael, our two reporters. So first of all, someone has asked, is there a clear definition in the law of the word terrorist?
Well,
I mean, anywhere.
Tangerine, the law doesn't actually say terrorist. It says you may not give substantial support to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or associated forces.
Which is undefined.
Which we don't know what it means.
Right.
And is Hamas an associated force? You know, the government says, of course not, but many Americans have supported Hamas. both ideologically and in terms of the things they write and say. They're going to be chilled and put into fear of doing so because we don't know whether that is going to be deemed enough to land them in military detention. So it's the lack of any definition at all in this law that creates the chilling effect and which makes it unconstitutional.
But could I ask a question? This is Dan Ellsberg. Two things. Would it be reading unduly into the law to say that a group that is called officially or identified as a terrorist group would come under the heading of associated groups? Is that a much of a stretch?
Well, I think most Americans think that Hamas shares a philosophy similar to that of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. They're violent anti-U.S. groups that challenge our political and cultural assumptions. And I think most Americans think these groups all have a similar ideology. And if that's true, if most Americans think that, then that's enough to put that chilling effect on people's speech. So I'd say the answer to that is yes, Jim.
Well, the reason I ask that is that, after all, Julian Assange has been called a high-tech terrorist. I think that was by Biden, who agreed with that description. Peter King, is he now the chairman of the subcommittee or the committee on Homeland Security? He has been described WikiLeaks as a terrorist organization, for God's sake. Bradley Manning, as I said earlier, is charged in his trial with giving aid and comfort by the revelations he made to terrorist groups, including, I think, Al-Qaeda in the Middle East. So that it would seem to me that support of them, which I certainly do give publicly, comes under the heading of well, again, these are groups. It's ridiculous, of course, to call either Bradley Manning or Assange a terrorist. That's absurd. And yet, that absurdity has occurred. They have been called that. Doesn't that mean that when I support them, that I could be held to be supporting an associated group?
That's precisely the chill that this statute casts over the entire nation.
I'd just like to chime in real quick here and say when I was detained in Newark, I had actually one of the agents from the U.S. government say, so that's what a terrorist looks like these days, and was talking directly about me. But the thing is that they did not know that I could hear them saying it. It was while the door was opening to an interrogation room with a two-way mirror, and they didn't know that I was paying attention to them. So when they're talking about terrorism in some abstract sense, they're also very concretely taking people and calling them terrorists just directly as a way of saying it, and they have done that with me directly.
And as they attempted to do with Alexa O'Brien's group, U.S. Day of Rage, which they clearly were working with private cybersecurity firms to label U.S. Day of Rage or to label them as connected to a Muslim terrorist group. So, I want to get back to some audience questions quickly. Actually, let's jump to Kevin or Michael. You both are journalists. You both have been writing about this case and all kinds of civil liberties issues, I know, in the case of Kevin. So let's start with Kevin. Do you have any questions, thoughts, concerns of your own?
I think I want to thank you for bringing to the fore the reality that this is something that members of the press need to be concerned about. And I think that, the reply brief, I went through that recently today and took a look at it, and this independent standard, as the attorneys in this case were putting it in this brief, definitely indicates that there would be reason to be concerned about how it would be enforced. And I don't think I need to restate that. Bruce has stated multiple times here that about the chill effect that is being had. But I guess to add extra context and to go along with what Daniel Ellsberg has said, we've got Senator Dianne Feinstein right now, who is on this, the leader of this bipartisan offensive against disclosures of information. And this is something I've been tracking closely, and the reason why I bring it up is because it's quite startling to put this alongside what the government has been doing with the erosion of due process, because coupled with this erosion, that we see through this NDAA, you also see that the Senate, other members of Congress, people in the White House do not want to have a free flow of information, because when you get right down to it, the concern that Feinstein has goes directly to the fact that there are people that work for the New York Times, that work for the Washington Post, that have gotten very good at using sources and putting together stories on national security. And what they really want to do is clamp down on national security journalism. And you also get the sense that that's the sort of thing that they want to clamp down through the example, I believe that's in the brief, about Chris Hedges being detained in Saudi Arabia and being told that he left the press pool or had gone outside and was doing something that he wasn't supposed to within the press pool. The fact that there is this sort of expectation, and you feel it, I feel it as well when I'm at Fort Meade. You want to feel like somebody who's there and should not be. Go to Fort Meade and get media credentials and spend a week covering the trial of Bradley Manning, and that's exactly what you're going to feel.
This is Bruce Afran. I'm going to actually have to leave the webcast, as I mentioned, so I just wanted to thank you for all you've done. And, Carl and I work together, and Carl's here. And I also want to mention David Reams and Bob Jaffe, the other two lawyers who joined us and have worked very hard with us. So unless you have anything else to ask of me, I'm going to thank all your listeners and congratulate you on a great panel.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for all the work you've done. I do have a couple questions on your brief that you just submitted, but I'm assuming I can ask those of Carl.
I think so.
Okay. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Good day, all.
Carl, so actually, following along the lines of what Kevin just said, I want to jump in with something, which is there are a number of undefined or vague terms that were, again, the impetus for us to come forth and file this multi-plaintiff suit. But the government just added a few more in one of their briefs, or a couple more in one of their briefs, and those were independent journalism and independent advocacy, which obviously I have no idea. I don't know if anyone on this call has any idea what that means. So can you say a little bit about how that actually made things a little bit worse for us in the sense of reason to be concerned, following up on Kevin's comment?
Right. Well, I don't know that it makes things worse for us, meaning journalists, activists, or activist lawyers. But the government is trying to essentially squirm out of the judge's preliminary injunction by saying in their briefs that people engaged in independent journalism wouldn't be captured under this statute. The problem is that contradicts the government's lawyers' very statements that they made at the original hearing back in May on the record. And it also creates a wholly new category of actors, which they call independent journalists. And it's very hard to determine or even define what an independent journalism would be, because, for example, Chris Hedges was embedded with groups that were considered to be terrorists by the United States State Department, and reported on their activities and conveyed their views to the public. Well, because he is conveying their views, does that make him an independent journalist? If he writes an article that is sympathetic as an opinion piece of some group's goals, does that make him an independent journalist? I think it's an impossible category for the government to defend. It's another distraction. Our job on Tuesday is to try to knock down all these distractions that the government's trying to erect to change the government's change Judge Ford's preliminary injunction.
Gotcha. Well, and I think several people on this call, myself included, definitely Birgitta, Jacob, for working previously with WikiLeaks. If WikiLeaks did end up getting officially labeled a terrorist organization, then I think there's no way to call the activities of even our entire team with RevolutionTruth as independent entirely. I mean, it's a complete gray area that remains undefined, and of course somewhat alarming to myself and my team for sure. We've got a few questions. I want to jump quickly to Michael Kelley, who hasn't had a chance to say anything yet. Michael, any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts?
Yeah, I have one thing I want to touch on. What Kevin brought up about the anti-leak measure approved by the Senate Intelligence Committee that outlaws background briefings of unclassified information. I asked Elizabeth Gottheim, of the co-director of the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, about that, and she said that it's hard not to look at that provision and not see it as an anti-whistleblower provision because it goes so far in essentially trying to deal with the problem of leaks. So I just wanted to touch on that because Kevin brought it up. And I have a question for Carl, specifically about the May 16th order.
Yeah.
In it, Judge Forrest says, Congress can add definitional language to the statute and resolve the issue the plaintiffs have raised and the court has flagged by adding definitions and imposing a signature requirement. So adding a definition so that it's not vague, so vague that people don't know that they're violating it. It can resolve the issues with the statute and proceed with enforcement activities it deems fit. And I wanted your opinion. What do you think about that piece of the order?
Well, I think Judge Forrest is highlighting the fact that this statute doesn't contain any definitions. I've never encountered in 25 years of legal practice a law that doesn't have a definitional section, and I think that's intentional. Daniel Ellsberg knows this. Birgitta knows this. The other plaintiffs know this. The government tries to keep things vague so that they can prosecute whomever it is that they want to target. It's this sort of vagueness that's the enemy of not just free speech but of due process. And until Congress corrects it, the law, I believe, will continue to be held unconstitutional. And the only way that it can correct it is to make it clear that people such as yourself, journalists or activists, or anyone working with journalists and activists, can't fall under the ambit of the statute. If they want to if Congress wants to make it clear that, for example, someone providing arms and munitions to a group that is actively planning an attack on American citizens, that's one thing. That would be a clear definition. But until they do, I'm hoping that this judge will hold fast and that her rulings will be upheld on appeal.
So you think that if the definitions are added and the signature requirement is added, then if the vagueness is taken care of Section 1021, then it will go from a boundless scope to a scope that would be manageable for you as a lawyer?
Excellent question.
Right. I think depending on what the definition is, but if it limits the scope to people who provide concrete physical material support to certain organizations, that might save it from being unconstitutional. But this is all speculation because I'm not sure Congress wants to go back to the drawing board on this. Maybe they do, maybe they don't.
Well, Congress has exhibited a lot of reticence around defending our liberties of late. In fact, the day after Judge Forrest ruled her preliminary injunction was an incredibly strong order in our favor. I mean, it was a facial ruling, which, as I understand it, Carl, is that this section was declared unconstitutional on its face. I mean, that's a very thorough ruling. Yet the next day, Congress overwhelmingly defeated an amendment to the NDAA that would have diminished some of that expanded scope of powers and vagueness. And I know, David Segal, you have worked very hard alongside us. I want to give a quick shout out actually to David Segal and Demand Progress. They have been an incredible partner in this case. They have been very good to us. They have raised money to help us pay court costs, which are coming out of pocket. And they have ensured that we sent over, I think, 65,000 emails to Congress, which ultimately didn't sway Congress, but they've been instrumental in this case thus far. So thank you so much for everything, David, and everybody out there. Please support Demand Progress. They're an awesome group. So on that, I guess next up we have a lot of questions about, will this be appealed and go to the Supreme Court? And I guess to staying with you, David, for a second, what are your thoughts on this so far, and what we can do to keep fighting and to get the public involved to make sure that we win this case?
I'm thrilled by the success to date, and honored to be on a panel with all of you. I would say that though we lost in the House on the attempt to overturn the indefinite detention provision, there are, I guess, varying definitions of overwhelming loss when you're talking about work in this context, and sometimes you lose, 400 to 3, and sometimes you lose 240 to 180, which I think was the approximate order of magnitude of the loss on the amendment to undo the indefinite detention provisions, which I frankly thought was relatively close. It was close enough that if we hadn't lost 40 or so Democrats, we would have actually won the amendment. There were enough Republicans joining us in that effort. And I think that's a function to some extent of awareness that this lawsuit's helped build, and to other grassroots organizing that's happened, a lot of which has been done by Demand Progress and its members. And we're pivoting towards the Senate now, and have sent in, I don't have the exact number, but many tens of thousands of contacts, and members have made many thousands of phone calls to the Senate on this issue. And I hope that as the lawsuit proceeds, and hopefully if we achieve the permanent injunction later this month, that we'll be able to use that moment to generate more public awareness and pivot back towards the Senate and bring pressure to bear on senators to undo indefinite detention when they take up next year's Defense Authorization Act, which should happen this fall.
Excellent. So I just want to quickly add to that. Anyone out there, if you're an activist and you're fighting for civil liberties, human rights, etc., I'm sure we all have fatigue from feeling like it's a constant onslaught. It is worth it to sign things. Don't lose hope on that front. Keep doing, keep signing the things that Demand Progress is sending out. That's the things that we're sending out. It does make a difference. And when you start to think that it doesn't, think about Judge Forrest, what she did in May, what we're aiming for, and the fact that we can win. So I'm going to open it up actually to, I guess, anyone on this panel. We haven't heard from Birgitta in a while. Daniel, you have amazing things to say as well. So we've got a few questions I'll probably pepper in between, but I'm going to open it back up to sort of a general discussion, Laura and Jacob as well. So, next steps. Sorry, let me start out with this. A lot of people are concerned that this will be appealed if we do win a permanent injunction, and that it then could go all the way to the Supreme Court. What are the steps in between, and what do we think about our chances of winning if this does go to the Supreme Court? Carl.
So the question is, what are the chances of winning if it goes to the Supreme Court?
Well, how many? So it'll go to the appellate court if the government appeals, and then what is after that? And
well, it goes if the government does decide to appeal. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We're assuming that Judge Forrest will issue a permanent injunction on Tuesday or sometime thereafter, after she hears our final arguments on Tuesday. If we're able to persuade her to issue a permanent injunction, that would be very powerful, because appeals then take a long time, and in the meantime, the act would be null and void. If it goes to appeal to the Second Circuit is usually pretty good on civil liberties issues, and actually one of the cases that we rely on in this case is a case called Amnesty International versus Clapper. There was a Second Circuit case involving warrantless wiretapping, in which the court said that journalists had standing to attack. Ultimately, if it goes to the Supreme Court, this is a tough fight, and always has been. There only been about 130 laws that have been declared unconstitutional and upheld as unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the history of the nation. But I think the judge's opinion is a very solid one and is based. She was very clever in basing it on First Amendment doctrine, even including the Citizens United case, which very broadly and vastly expands First Amendment rights even for corporations and elections. But she used that opinion, which is supported by the conservative majority, to say, well, if you support the First Amendment for corporations and elections, you have to come in aggressively for the First Amendment in this case as well. So Bruce and I are eternally optimistic, and we'll fight to the end.
You know, actually, a quick question before we do open it up, Carl, because, I didn't mean to jump the gun. I'm obviously not assuming that what Judge Forrest will do next week. We're hoping that she will provide a permanent injunction. But if she did not, then what would our next steps be? Just sort of an idea of that. I know a lot of people are wondering.
Well, if she does not, well, then there are several options. We could appeal, or if she were to not rule in our favor on standing grounds, at that juncture we could seek additional plaintiffs, such as the people who have participated in this call. And and I just want to say again, this is an incredible effort from many people on different continents, and the fact that you and David and the rest of the plaintiffs have put together a group and a team that is willing to fight not just in the legislative branch in Congress, but also in the judicial branch and in the executive branch, and also to fight globally. That's what's needed. And I want to thank you, Tangerine, for doing that, and it's been an honor to represent the plaintiffs.
Well, cheers to that, and also to the whole entire Revolution Truth team, who all work as volunteers. So we're all volunteers on this case, and it's funny because I think the word activist or dissident is too often used pejoratively, and I have to say that over the last 2 years, I would say those terms hold nothing but honor for me. I mean, I know that, I hope that, I don't know that we'll be recognized for what we do, and that's not the point of it, but I hope that people like us who do sacrifice so much, and so many people who are listening to this, that we can rest assured that we know for certain that what we're doing will hopefully change history, and eventually will be recognized not as something fringe or radical, or I don't know what the government is trying to claim. The latest brief that they submitted, basically, it was offensive. I mean, it made it look like me and the rest of the 6 plaintiffs are soft enemies of the United States government for daring to file this lawsuit. So, no. Actually, we are staunchly in support of the Constitution and human rights everywhere, and that is to be lauded on the part of every single one of us. So, that said, let's see, we've got a bunch of questions, but Birgitta, do you have anything you want to jump in with here? Or?
No, I just think that it is important that people recognize the fact that because our work has changed so much, so laws in the United States will impact people all over the world, and laws in the EU will impact people also all over the world. So because of the Internet, the legal jurisdictions have all changed. And so it is extremely important that we have won this case so far. It's important for all our fights that we're fighting for freedom of information, freedom of speech, and freedom of expression in our new residency, which is the Internet. And many people forget how easy it is to go about, just like Daniel Ellsberg was pointing out, and basically getting our full picture, our sacred person, taken into any governmental agency. And it is quite interesting how people are blind to the fact that we have so little privacy rights online, where most of our information is stored in one way or another. So I'm extremely pleased that we won this case so far, and I'm very proud of being a part of groups that are not only fighting for themselves but for everybody else, and that is already having an impact. And I hope that we will carry on not only with this but through the endless battles and endless bad laws that we're dealing with, just like with SOPA and ACTA and PIPA and CISPA. They're always bringing out something new that actually impacts everybody in the world.
So thank you, Birgitta, and your comment on our new residency, which is the internet, and obviously that's the territory over in which many of us conduct much of our daily business of protecting liberties. So it's an amazing and dynamic, changing situation. Speaking of that, we have a number of questions that have come in. There is a lot of concern about Dianne Feinstein's attempt to prosecute leakers and investigate leaks. And one of the questions that came in, maybe David Segal can answer this, is are you aware of any initiatives similar to Reddit's test pack against Lamar Smith but applied to Feinstein?
No, I'm not aware of any attempts to take her on electorally at this point.
Okay.
I suppose I don't have much more to say to it. I mean, I would encourage people to do whatever sort of organizing they feel able to do to bring greater attention to these issues and to upset. But she's also, I mean, Glenn Greenwald's done a great job of covering her historic shilling for the surveillance state, for military-industrial complex, et cetera. So she's probably difficult to sway on this sort of issue. So
if that's not the best tact to take with that, well, actually, one person has added to that question, which is a special prosecutor, the call for a special prosecutor by Feinstein to investigate leaks. Isn't this an end run around injunction? Carl, can you say anything to that effect?
I'm sorry.
So,
repeat the question, Tangerine?
Yeah, so Dianne Feinstein has called for a special prosecutor to investigate leaks, and one of our audience members has asked if that's possibly an end run around injunction, under the around the injunction that was granted by Judge Forrest for our case. I
don't think so, because targeting leakers or people who work for the government that leak documents is a more specific targeting than the NDAA or the Homeland Battlefield Bill, which would broadly encompass a whole range of journalistic and activist activity. It still is what they're trying to do in ferreting out whistleblowers and cracking down on whistleblowers does have a chilling effect on journalism. I wouldn't characterize it as an end run, but it's another way of chilling journalism and speech. It does it differently. It does it more precisely, and it's another unfortunate trend. There are so many of these. There are so many of these assaults on civil liberties, from the drones. I mean, it comes out constantly. There was a report, I think, 2 weeks ago, that there are now over 100 different federal and state agencies that have applied for exemptions from the FAA to fly drones over American airspace. So we see where that's going. So it's part and parcel of the expanding security state. But I don't think it can't circumvent the judge's injunction if the judge's injunction stands.
And her more recent calls for a special prosecutor have been relative to the leaks that have supposedly been emanating from the White House. So they aren't really leaks that would probably be prosecuted through this authority. The FISA amendment's a different story, but her latest comments didn't really apply towards activists, towards so much as members of the executive staff, as far as I can tell.
And would that have included Thomas Drake when he was still working with the NSA?
I think that she was getting more at these leaks that have been that are sort of favorable to the White House, that make Obama look like a tough guy, that speak to his oversight of the drone program and that sort of thing. I mean she's terrible on the other stuff too, on the legitimate, whistleblowing, but just trying to, I'm just trying to get it, like the more narrow intention of those more recent comments she made.
And that's important.
I'm sorry, if I may jump in.
Please.
Kevin pointed out in an article earlier this week about that the provision in the 2013 Intelligence Authorization Act that it may have to do with frustration with the government's case against Thomas Drake falling apart. So I think I agree that it could be connected with Thomas Drake's the case against him falling apart and this coming to just wipe out any intelligence analysts giving background on any unclassified info, because that would take care of that problem. They wouldn't have to prosecute.
Gotcha.
Hi, it's Dan Ellsberg. Can I make a comment on this?
Please.
We go back to my earlier point. When Dianne Feinstein wants a prosecutor against people like myself 40 years ago who revealed classified information, definitely. Presumably she has in mind the so-called Espionage Act. I call it, that's not its official name. It's 18 U.S.C. 793. But meant to be used against espionage. Now, the fact that there had been no earlier prosecutions before 1971, mine, since 1917, meant that it was recognized, understandably, that our First Amendment forbade our having an act as the British Official Secrets Act, which criminalizes all revelation to the public of classified information, something that any government agency has marked classified or protected. Congress had never passed such an act. And as a matter of fact, and that's why there had been no prosecutions. Mine was an experiment. As I say, 10 years later, there was one more experiment with Samuel Loring Morrison. Now, Congress did pass such an act, actually, in October, November of 2000, under the last stages of the Clinton administration. And Clinton vetoed that. So we still don't have such an act, an official secrets act. And we should never have it. The First Amendment does really preclude that. And if we do pass such an act signed by another president now, the First Amendment will have been pretty seriously abridged or rescinded as far as the revelation of information about what the government calls national security. So if Feinstein, of course, is trying to go ahead with the act that President Obama has been abusing now so seriously in contrast to all his predecessors. If they get away with that, there'll be more of it. If they don't get away with it, actually, if the Supreme Court should finally rule on the issue, which it never has addressed, whether that act is constitutionally applicable to disclosures to the American public, then some of the prevailing resolutions that have already been introduced in Congress by various people for an official secrets act will be pressed. And that will come up for discussion in Congress. And I have to say, very unhappily, will probably pass. And if it were passed, but what I'm saying right now is we should be opposing that right now. We should be upholding the First Amendment and its proscription against any such criminalization of classified information, doing the best we can, and we're against the tide. People who agree with me on this are probably at this point in the minority of the public. But people who know the history of the statute in this case and the various other attempts to create an official secrets act, it's time for them to be very active in opposing this encroaching regulation, essentially clamp down of free speech. And that's why I do want to applaud the people who pressed this case. I must say that I joined it feeling that it was an appropriate effort to get an injunction, but I certainly didn't have any particular hope that it would get anywhere. Why not?
The lack of faith.
Oh. So I don't know what has been such good news. And one federal judge actually upholding the Constitution. Incredible. After a decade now of attacks in terms of detention and torture and NSA wiretapping and all that stuff, none of it really obstructed by the courts. At last, one judge was appealed to. Wouldn't have happened without your initiative in bringing the case. And we actually got to a ruling. So it shows that there is a possibility for defending the First Amendment of the Constitution here, but it takes initiative, it takes some boldness, some courage, and some unwillingness to be chilled right now.
Well said. Actually, this could go to the reporters on the call, and we've only got a few minutes left, and then we're going to basically wrap up. But one thing that is, I think, struck all of us, or many of us, as if not completely unexpected, still extremely unfortunate, is that the mainstream media has evinced a total disinterest in this case. Not total, but it has been largely disinterested in this case. And when we did win our temporary injunction in May, we finally got a blurb in Reuters, the AP. Charlie Savage kindly wrote an editorial in the New York Times after that, and is planning on writing about the judge's ruling next week. Excuse me. But the fact that we have been unable to be covered in the mainstream media as a significant story and significant win, which it is, we needed that to help sway public opinion, to educate the public about what is going on, and it's not happening. So what can we do as concerned citizens and journalists and activists to overcome this seeming media blockade against such critical news?
Well, Tangerine.
Yes.
I think that, what's interesting is to actually hear Glenn Greenwald say and admit that he had so much skepticism about the possibility of this winning that he had chosen to not really do much coverage of it at all. I'm not trying to knock him. I'm just saying that he actually made this clear. And I think the difference comes from the orientation, because the media was looking at what you were trying to do in the sense of, could it actually produce the result that you were trying to go for? I think they thought you were living out a fantasy that there could be some kind of an outcome that would go towards, making some sort of change or address the First Amendment implications of the NDAA. Whereas I, who will take credit for covering this from the beginning, saw what activists were doing. We're stepping up. Of course, I actually know Alexa O'Brien, and I was familiar with some other people, so that gave me added interest. But the reason why I covered it closely was because it just seemed so obvious, given the way that civil liberties have eroded in the last decade, and also in addition to the fact that Congress and the White House are not doing anything about these civil liberties issues. And then also, when you think about elections, liberties seem to be the most unsexy issues in America, that people, you have to struggle to have any conversation about freedom of speech or First Amendment issues in that sort of debate, in that realm. And so I thought, this is actually a good thing, that there are activists, there are people who are putting their names to a lawsuit. This is something that can have impact. And it seems like it might be the last way that people could actually have some sort of impact and preserve any sort of liberties that we might have left in this country, because by taking that initiative, either, in this case, waiting before it even really took effect, really taking a preemptive step to ensure that nothing happened. And the big thing here that people all should understand is that there are these lists out there that anybody can get on. So, we're not just talking about whether you're associated forces, then we're talking about, are you put on a no-fly list and you have no way to challenge being put on a no-fly list, or Are we talking about, in the most extreme case, you're Samir Khan or you're Abdul Rahman al-Awlaki or his father, and you're put on a kill list, and you're going to be, killed by Obama's Star Chamber, who decides that you should be taken out and denied judicial process. So it's incredibly critical that people are taking this step and are actually challenging it before it even has a chance to develop into something that metastasizes, because it will. I mean, the way that things are going with people being so complacent and having no care whatsoever about, the sort of impact, it takes a few people actually saying, stop, putting out a red alert so that people take notice, and you got me to notice, and I did some interviews, and then now I'm committed to regular coverage.
And we really, really appreciate all the work that you do, Kevin. And I think you made a bunch of good points there. It's promising to see that what we just won, and hopefully we will gain a permanent injunction as well, and to be continued onward and upward for all of this. So I think I'm going to have to wrap up the call. We're an hour and 20 minutes in. If anyone has any burning last comments or questions or thoughts, then I'll let you jump in now, and then I've got a couple announcements to make before we end the call.
I wanted to bring up one thing in regard of the rest of the NDAA, in the sense that there was the Marine Corps created its first law enforcement battalion, and so it's 500 military police officers and dozens of dogs, 3 sets of them. And just to touch on the militarization in general, we kind of saw that in Anaheim on Sunday with these what look like policemen in military gear. So I read the article in the Marine Times, Corps create law enforcement battalions. I just thought it was relevant.
Yeah, and we saw that with Occupy as well. That and we could have a whole other panel on Occupy and what happened with that. The coordinated shutdown and the military presence was interesting in certain cases. So, a couple. Yeah.
Just jump in, and I just wanted to. It's David Segal from Demand Progress again. I just wanted to reiterate that though I have essentially no faith in our legislative institutions in general, this is an issue. It's not a Patriot Act that passes with one no vote. There's still some legislative hope, I think, to ameliorate some of the problems that we have with the NDAA. There were amendments that were offered to revoke the clauses in question or to modify them last time around in December in the Senate, and they failed, but they failed while receiving 45 votes. And we saw a new core of senators come together over the course of the last couple of weeks to make a real press in support of pro-privacy amendments to attach to the cybersecurity bill that actually failed to achieve cloture today. And several of those senators opposed cloture. Several Democrats joined with the Republicans and opposed cloture. So I think that there is something brewing there, and some hope that a small number of senators will take this on as activists and convince the broader membership to stand with us on this issue. And those votes that happened in December came when there was even less public outcry than there is now, and there was essentially no public awareness of this as the votes happened. Then the Daily Show took it on, and there have been a few articles here and there. We're able to keep building pressure and use the lawsuit to attune the public to the issue. That I think there is some hope of fixing things through the legislative track.
And I think, David, you bring up a really good point, which is the problems that we face are systemic, they're complex, and that we need a multi-pronged approach. We need to take the legislative approach, the judicial approach, the media approach, the internet approach. I mean, a multi-pronged approach in this day and age for what we're facing is imperative. And it's interesting because I think that this lawsuit is one of the, I don't know if it's the first, but it's one of the few where we've combined these disparate approaches to tackle this, and so far we've been successful. So I think that it's not just something that's incredibly exciting if we do win. Obviously it's so important, and hopefully it can also be a test case for future work for us to come together and keep fighting things and winning. So yeah, I think there's a lot to hope for, and I think that you're right. what we face in Congress at the federal level is a systemic problem. It's not necessarily individuals, and I don't want to go off on that, but I think we do need to give credit to those who have stood against this and who are also willing to change their minds. So that said, I want to make a quick announcement. We did launch our new website, stopndaa.org. There you will find information on all of our plaintiffs. On the case itself, you'll find a section about what you can do, how you can support us. And obviously, we want to win, so please stay tuned with everything that is going on. Next week, as Carl mentioned, on August 7th is the hearing in court. And if you are in Manhattan, by all means, show your support in the courtroom. So I want to...
will be allowed in the courtroom?
I'm sorry?
Will they allow cameras or recorders in the courtroom?
I don't believe they do, Carl. Do they allow recorders or cameras in the courtroom?
I don't believe so, but you should check with the court clerk at the Southern District of New York. If you just go to the Southern District of New York Federal Court website, you can get in touch with the court clerk, and they'll give you the protocol.
Great. So I want to thank everybody on this call. First and foremost, Carl Mayer, Bruce Afran, and Chris Hedges, who couldn't be with us today, for bringing forth this suit. Demand Progress and Revolution Truth, and all of the people who work with us, all of our co-plaintiffs, Daniel Ellsberg, Birgitta, Alexa O'Brien, Kai Wargala, who did an amazing job in court in March, and the reporters on this call who are covering it, and all of our audience as well, and also Jacob and Laura. I know you didn't get a chance to say too much today. I'd like to have you both on a smaller panel so we can hear more from you if you're amenable to that sometime down the road. And thank you for sharing your stories with us, because I think they're illustrative of the fact that we do have reason to be concerned, and hopefully we win this case. So, and also our audience. Thank you, everyone in our audience who is working so hard day in and day out to protect our liberties and to figure out how to do so. So I think that this is a great start, and we have a lot of good things going on across the country and around the world in defense of our liberties and human rights. So onward and upward, and thank you, everyone, for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.